This time we're going to be looking at Psalm 63. The title of Psalm 63 is a Psalm of David when he was in the wilderness of Judah. Well, like most Psalms, we believe it to be either him in the wilderness running from King Saul or his son Absalom. The wilderness years fighting and running from King Saul is the one that is most agreed on. But in those first two verses, we see David's thirst for God. He says, "Oh God, you are my God. Early will I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry land and thirsty land where there is no water. So I have looked for you in the sanctuary to see your power and your glory." Well, David says to God that he was David's God. In a time when pagans thought and worshiped many gods, David sweeps such ideas aside and tells God, "You are my God." You and I live in that same type of a culture where in your city or in your zip codes, many people believe in multiple gods. Plus, there are those who have self as a God. But if you and I really believed in God, seeking him early would be the priority of the day. The thirst of David's soul demanded to be satisfied early in the day. Now, that word early has not only the meaning of the first thing in the morning, but also a sense of urgency and intentionality and eagerness and importance. We might say, seek God ASAP or as soon as possible, and do it with intentionality. This reminds us of, as the deer pants for the water, so my heart pants for you, O God. David sought God as a tabernacle, as earnestly at the tabernacle and earnestly as a thirsty man would in the wilderness. And the wilderness of Judah is largely, of course, deserted. So this was an image of thirst that came easily into David's mind. We sometimes are there spiritually, yet we attempt to quench that thirst naturally. Money, popularity, family, things we own, etc., etc. David sought God at the tabernacle to connect in some way with God's power and glory. Now, David wasn't at the tabernacle, of course, when he's singing and writing this song. He was in the wilderness of Judah. And yet he knew that God's sanctuary was not only a place, but it was also a spiritual place that could be entered by faith no matter where you are. In verses 3 and 6, David says that the greatness of God's love results in his praise. So what does he say? He says, "Because of your loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall praise you. Thus I will bless you while I live. I will lift up my hands in your name. My soul shall be satisfied with marrow and fatness, and my mouth shall praise you with joyful lips when I remember you on my bed and I meditate on you in the night watches." Well, why was David so motivated to seek God? Well, it was God's loving kindness. And his loving kindness was better and more real to David than life itself. People regard life as natural, but here David, he regarded and enjoyed God's love. People enjoy life. David enjoyed God's great love. People value life, but David valued the love of God. People will sacrifice to live, but David would sacrifice for God's great love. Life, books, movies are filled with people who love someone or something more than their own life, and it could be said that for them that they held love better than life. Well, David meant that the love of God to him was more precious than his own life. When we know God's love, it overflows into our expressing out loud, say and hear, singing praise to God. Wouldn't it be ungrateful not to praise and thank God who loved us, who we know God demonstrated his love in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And it's amazing how the church even takes for granted that amazing grace. Have you spoken with God today? Is that one of your priorities, to connect with God? Or can we just take it or leave it? It's not right for us to treat God with indifference. Saying he would bless, David said he would bless the Lord. And David didn't mean in the sense that he was a greater person blessing a lesser person. But David meant this in the sense that it blessed and honored God for his people to praise him and to be thankful towards him. The lifting up of hands that David talks about was appropriate for praise. It displayed the anticipation of receiving from God as well as surrendering to God. And David spoke of a contentment that some Christian believers don't show. There's a great satisfaction and contentment that comes in seeking more of God, of receiving his great love and praising God at all times. So David couldn't get enough of God, so he also used those night watches to meditate on God. And though we as Christians, we need community, being alone and quiet in the night watches is a great time for meditation on the mercies of God. Also, the nighttime can be described as a lonely, dark period of life, and meditating on God will bring joy and song in the night. Going on to verses 7 and 8, David thanks God for his continued help. It says, "Because you have been my help, therefore in the shadow of your wing I will rejoice. My soul follows close behind you. Your right hand holds me up." Many of David's psalms are simple cries for help. In this one, this has no present cry, but it gives thanks for and praise for God's faithfulness in many times when God had helped David. And maybe you know that experience to be true in your life. The idea of the shelter of the shadow of God's wings is repeated many times throughout Psalms. Sometimes it has the idea of protection as a mother bird shelters her young chicks. Other times it has the idea of presence, God just being there. How on earth are we going to make it in this life? It's going to be through his protection, his presence, and his power. What a great statement for you and I when he says, "My soul follows close behind you, and your right hand upholds me." Well, next in verses 9 and 10, he declares his trust despite the trouble. He says, "But those who seek my life to destroy it shall go into the lower parts of the earth. They shall fall by the sword. They shall be a portion for jackals." No surprise to you, David's deep relationship with God didn't take away his problems. And according to its title, Psalm 63 was written from the wilderness of Judah, and David was in the wilderness hiding from those and from a conspiracy to kill him. David left it in God's hand to deal with his enemies, especially with King Saul, but in God's time and in God's way. David's enemies did fall by the sword, which had the sense of them being killed in battle. David describes the results of those against him and God as a portion for jackals. David, being a warrior and being on many battlefields, probably saw the jackals, if you were, tearing apart dead bodies. And I remember reading that the jackals didn't leave much left for other animals. And so, it's not wise to war against God and his people. Just saying. David closes showing his confidence. He says, "But the king shall rejoice in God. Everyone who swears by him shall glory, but the mouth of those who speak lies shall be stopped." David wasn't yet on Israel's throne, and the promises still waited to be fulfilled. Yet it was a promise of God, and so by faith, David calls himself the king, and in faith rejoices in God. The sense of he swears by God is to trust in God. The contrast of trusting God to speaking lies, we resort to lies when we don't trust God. One of these paths is the future of glory, and the other will be stopped. In a difficult season, how do we get to this place of trust and contentment and praise and spiritual maturity that David seems to be showing us here? Well, you go back to those first two verses where he says, "Oh God, you are my God. Early I will seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry and thirsty land where there is no water. So I have looked for you in the sanctuary to see your power and your glory." Well, I hope this has been a help to you today. Thanks for being with us and looking at these selected Psalms, and we'll see you next time.